Well, thanks for coming, everyone. Hopefully we don't have a storm take over the night tonight. Hopefully it'll just hold out a little bit longer. But thank you for coming. This is the third in our four-part summer open house series, and we're really happy to have Sommer Mathis here with us tonight. For those of you who have been to the first two, you know the setup here, but I'll just go through it so you know what we're after. And it seems funny because I'm talking into a microphone, but it doesn't sound like I'm talking into a microphone. So it's not. Well, it is, but it's only for Don's purposes. So we're doing that just so that we can be recording it, and it'll be used tomorrow on our site. But we have 10 minutes timed to get a couple questions in with Sommer Mathis about the topic that the entire series is about, is pushing the envelope in storytelling. So I've got a few questions for her on how she's pushing the envelope and how the platform that she's with now, CityLab, is doing some pretty cool things in journalism and pushing the envelope. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then when we finish our formal Q&A, we'll turn it over to you guys and ask some questions, and she may ask a question of you too. We'll see how it goes. So we are tweeting tonight, and so if you are tweeting, it's hashtag CFox10. We've got some busy fingers over there working hard. Yeah, let's get going. So first, let me just say that, when I thought about doing this series, you were the first name that popped into my head, and I'm really glad that you're here tonight because we've worked together a number of times over the last many, many years, and I've watched you go from DCist to TBD and now to The Atlantic and their new sister site called CityLab. I love your style and your process and how you tell the story, so I'm just glad you're here in this seat. So thanks for taking the time to do it. I want to start with this idea of what CityLab really is. So for those of you who are familiar with it, CityLab had been called Atlantic Cities, and we'll talk about the name change in a minute. But it's all about urbanization and how cities are essentially changing the way we live and how we consume and everything around us. And you call urbanization the story of the century. And I'm going to quote here how you've described it, because I think it's important for people to hear this. There's never been a greater opportunity and need to make sense of the issues, challenges, and excitement of city life. CityLab will claim this space, explaining the way we live today. Our millions of readers will find the coverage they expect and will reach new audience in cities all over the world with content that's both relevant and entertaining. So let's start first with the framing of this new site, and tell me about the name change.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we first launched the Atlantic Cities 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, it was September of 2011. The idea was really that the Atlantic was looking to branch out into a space they'd never been in before, which is really kind of a niche space. The Atlantic's obviously a really broad general interest magazine. It's over 150 years old. They also have a really robust website, theatlantic.com, and then they had a second site that was called previously The Atlantic Wire and is now called The Wire. And so they were interested in trying to see whether the Atlantic brand could kind of carry over into a niche space that where they would kind of carve out almost like a B2B audience in a way, where you would have, whether that made sense to it, people who were familiar with the Atlantic, and the idea of doing a site about cities was really inspired by Richard Florida, who's a very prominent professor and author in the city space, and he had been a senior editor and written some cover stories for the Atlantic for some time, but there was also this idea that, well, okay, so writing about cities, writing about urbanism. So when we talk about urbanism, it's transportation, housing, infrastructure, how we're living in cities today. That's maybe the broadest niche topic anyone could possibly think of, because so in a way it's so we really wanted to have urban planners and city managers and architects reading the website, but we also wanted it to be broadly, generally interesting and entertaining for a really wide audience, and we wanted to see if we could do that. We wanted to see if we could make us an online magazine that appealed to both kind of professional people who are professionally interested in what's happening in cities, and then also, just a really general interest audience, whether we could make those kind of very serious topics appealing and fascinating to as wide a range of people as possible. So that was kind of the whole idea behind the Atlantic Cities and now also CityLab.
Right. So what's the reaction been so far?
Well, to the name change or to the site, since we've existed.
Yeah, I think to the site.
So it's been really amazing. I mean, as you know, I came from local news before. I covered DC for 5 or 6 years as a local news reporter and an editor. And I had seen the level of interest in these kind of, I dare say, kind of nerdy urban issues really explode, especially in the DC area. You've got sites like Greater Washington and some of the other, there are some other great websites that are similar in other cities, but I had kind of watched the level of interest in, zoning issues and affordable housing and transportation planning really explode while I was covering the city and covering it from a perspective of neighborhood change. That was often my beat. So in a way, I wasn't. One of the reasons I wanted to do it in the beginning was because I knew there was an audience here and that people were really interested in this. And it's been great. We started with a really tiny team of 3 people running the Atlantic Cities. We now have about 9 people. I'm expecting to add a number of new people in the beginning of next year. So it's been really exciting, and the rebrand itself is. On the one hand, we actually just decided we liked the name CityLab better than the Atlantic Cities. It was always a little bit of a tongue twister, and also kind of confusing to the international audience who was less familiar with the Atlantic as a brand. It would get a lot of questions like, is this only about cities on the Atlantic Ocean? Is this about Atlantic City? So we just really loved the name CityLab because it kind of represented what we thought we were about, which is like experimentation in cities. But the other thing is that the Atlantic, I think, has a lot of faith in this project, and they wanted it to see if we could be kind of stand on its own with its own identity. And we're still very much a part of the Atlantic, but going ahead and changing the name was a gamble we were all willing to take because there's just a lot of support for the project.
Okay. So I want to probe on something that caught my eye when I was reading about CityLab, and you talk about solutions-based reporting, right? It's not just journalism for the sake of journalism, but you're trying to raise conversations and push conversations maybe a little bit harder than they have been pushed. And maybe that's not the way you describe it, but what do you mean by solutions-based reporting?
Right. Well, part of that is really, I think, actually goes back to the original idea of the Atlantic. Because we're part of the Atlantic, and the Atlantic it's always been about American ideas. It was founded by abolitionists, and the fundamental idea behind the Atlantic was about ideas. So when we're doing a site that's part of the Atlantic about cities, it has to be about ideas, great ideas that failed, ideas that are being teased out right now and that are affecting people's lives. So in the sense that we think about, we do have sort of a whole section of our site called City Fixer that are really focused on ideas that can be solutions for cities. And every time I think about whether a story is a great story for us, I think about is this just something that's only going to work in this one local circumstance, or is there a lesson here for every city? Is there a lesson here for a wide range of cities? And that's a lot of how I think about how we kind of frame what we're doing.
Right. Okay. So I want to talk about visual storytelling, because I know a lot of people here are interested in infographics and their role in telling a story. So if you go on CityLab, it just naturally feels different than a lot of other news sites. And I think that's because there's a high amount of visuals. You've created this site that's very responsive and different in its design and platform. But infographics have blown up in recent years, right? You think about USA Today's front page snapshot to where we are now.
Right.
So what makes a good infographic? I mean, how do you figure out how they work in to help tell a story?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we don't really use the word infographic that much, interestingly enough. We talk about data visualization. Which we think about maps a lot. We think about whether we have information that can be presented visually all the time, and that includes photography. That includes graphs and charts, and it includes a kind of a wide range of visuals, video certainly. But one of the things we did with the new site that was really important to me was we built article pages where you can really present very large, beautiful images. And a big part of the reason we did that is because there are a lot of sites that don't do that, and we wanted it to really stand out as striking. We wanted it to be a kind of visually arresting site that. So we, obviously the ability to go big also helps us tell stories better. But in addition to that, we wanted it to be beautiful. And this, as you mentioned, it's also a responsive design, which means it's going to look just as beautiful on your tablet and your phone as it is on your desktop screen. So all of that was pretty important as we kind of thought about how we wanted to redesign the site when we decided to do that.
Yeah. Do you see other websites following suit? Do you think you push the envelope a little bit?
Well, I think there are sites that have separate article templates that allow them to go wide occasionally, but what we did is we built it into every story. And so it's never a choice we have to make. We went ahead and decided to go for that every time. So I'm not sure I've seen a site do that. There may be some nonprofit sites that do it. Part of the issue there is where ads are placed. So if you're an if you're an ad revenue driven website, as we are, you have to think very carefully about how many ad impressions you get on every page. And so the ability to do that on a for-profit site is somewhat more difficult.
Yeah. Okay. Where are we on time? We're out. Okay, well then I'm going to ask you one last question, which has been the closing question that I've asked everybody so far, which is, since we consider ourselves storytellers too, we always like to think about the stories that have moved us the most and that inspire us to keep telling more and greater stories. So thinking about all of the work that you've done and the different kind of reporting you've done over the years, is there a story that's stuck with you? That's impacted you in
a story
some way?
that I reported? Oh, wow. Well, there was an ongoing story that I reported at sadly defunct TBD.com that was actually a kind of a sad story about a young man who died outside of a bar on 9th Street Northwest in the district. And I still think about it. It was something that kind of tore the community apart. It was my beat at the time was kind of neighborhood change and how DC's neighborhoods were changing, and this was like the epitome of that. It was bar staff involved with a young man who died in a struggle who was from the Ethiopian community, and it was months of kind of heartache on both sides. So that's a story that I think about a lot.
Thank you. So before I turn it over to our crowd here, is there anything that you'd want to ask of them?
Oh my goodness. I guess I'm curious. We spent a lot of time thinking about the growth of our mobile audience at The Atlantic, and this is across the board for every digital publisher, but I'd be curious to hear a little bit about how people are actually consuming the news and that they read on the internet at this point. Do you feel like it's mostly on your phone, or is it mostly on your desktop, or mostly on another mobile device?
I'll do show of hands. So who majority is reading news on their mobile device?
Phone or tablet.
Let's say both. Let's say phone or tablet versus desktop. Yeah. And what about people who are still mostly reading on their desktop?
Go big or go home. Right?
Yeah.
Can you ask it again in terms of phone or tablet?
So
Could you ask in terms of phone or tablet?
Oh, phone versus tablet. So how many people read more on their phone? And what about tablets? Yeah, so more phone. That's what I would have expected, actually. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Very cool. So does that affect the story length for you?
I do think about it. Yeah. We only publish on the internet, so we don't actually have space constraints in theory. We don't have pages that we have to fill. We can go as long as we want. But I do think about the length at which I expect our readers, who I know quite a bit about at this point, will kind of be willing to keep reading for any given story, especially because I know so many of them are reading on their phone.
Thank you all for being here and listening, and help yourselves to more wine and food, and thanks for coming. Thank you.